part of the session, what we're going to walk through, or this slide is going to become very familiar to you because we're going to anchor back to this as we continue to move through the materials today. There's different subject matters, different pieces of business analysis shown here, but this is not exhaustive by any means. I mean, there's much more to business analysis than what is shown here. And I also want to point out that this is not a linear approach by any means. Business analysis is very much iterative. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the life cycle of a program and where business analysis happens. So this shouldn't be thought of as linear. It's very much iterative. But as we move from left to right, you'll find that we'll call that out again and again as a key message. So let's start with the business case itself. So have people in this room worked on feasibility study reports, FSRs? Yeah, you've done those before? So I had to do my homework and learn all about FSRs. It's part of that process, right? You have to try to answer the question for the Department of Technology and to the Department of Finance. Is this worth investing in? What's the compelling business case? Why should we do this? Especially if you're in an environment of budgetary constraints, those asks need to be prioritized, and they should be driven by business need. And we're going to continue to say that again and again, is business value and business need should be at the center of that. And I know the Department of Technology is going to be rolling out some information on that as well, and bringing that to the center and driving from business need. So as you're trying to answer that question or find the answer to that question, is this project something that the state should invest in? You're going to be looking at first, again, your business problem or objectives. What is it that we're trying to solve from the business's point of view? And then, how do we measure success? How do we define what those metrics are? How are we going to define the business drivers, if you will? If it's a revenue enhancement project, maybe for a tax agency, or if it's a cost reduction effort, name any kind of function in the business in terms of operations and management for cost reduction. It could be a service level improvement. It could be internal service to your internal customers within your agencies or departments, or it could be the citizens that you're serving. Perhaps it's cycle time or processing time for an application or something like that. Any of those sound familiar, of course. So that's what you're trying to do in the business case. And what I wanted to emphasize here is not so much building that initial case, because I think if you have any experience with doing the FSR process, you're able to sort of quantify what's my one-time capital investment going to be in terms of software, hardware, fees to implement the software. And then your recurring costs, your run costs, you can identify those, right? So if there's any license fees or things like that to operate the solution afterwards, you can come up with those numbers through various ways. And then you're going to talk about what are the benefits, right? So if it is an uptick in revenue, how do you sort of ramp that, once the solution's in place? How do you show that over fiscal years? I might say that things are typically done in fiscal years, but if you look at it a bit more granular, at a quarter level, it can sometimes be helpful to plan at that quarter level to really see how that ramp works. As you assess that, it's important that, once you come up with, okay, this is what your, in the private sector you call it sort of return on investment, right? But there's an earned analysis worksheet, is that what it is, that sort of shows what that ramp is and what your payback period is? That's great. The important point, though, is that it's important to keep that business case a living document, so that once that actually gets approval, hopefully, and you move to implementation, that business case is then where you anchor back to make sure that you're actually hitting what you had envisioned in terms of recurring costs, recurring benefits, et cetera. And so one of the things that I like to recommend when I do business cases at the front end of a project is you actually build into that business case, and we'll talk about this later, what I call value events. And that's like a trigger, if you think about it as a trigger. So it's something that drives that business value. So say your business driver was to reduce cost of maintaining a data center, for example. And so if you're able to decommission servers as part of your implementation, or you're even able to close a data center as a result of your implementation, that is an event that's going to create value for the business. It can be quantified, it can be measured. And so you would put that in your business case along with a timing, and then when you build your work plans, your project plans, you actually put those in as milestones, and then you march toward those milestones and have a view of when that value is actually going to occur. And we'll talk more about that in benefits realization. There's a lot I could talk about in business cases, but we don't have.
She loves that stuff. Okay.
So, enough of that. No, not really. So, let's talk a little bit about another piece, and remember this isn't linear, but the stakeholders, the people part of people, process, technology. And this is a place where sometimes it's called change management. And there are interesting responses to this, but a common response is, I don't need no stinking change management. And it's interesting because you would never take on a big project and say, you know what, I'm going to leave out the whole technical analysis, and I'm just going to kind of jump in there. Or I'm not going to redesign the processes, I'm just going to let them happen. The people side of that process, again, as I said before, can be a really, really challenging one. So thinking about your stakeholders and how are you going to manage the effort with your people that are impacted. And the first piece in that is identifying who are your stakeholders. There's a million ways to do this, but pretty much any approach you're going to take is going to start with identifying who are the stakeholders. And that's people who may be actually involved in the project, that may be constituents, that may be people who actually are consumers of the service that your division or department provides. You want to think about who's going to be impacted by this work, because that's going to give you information about how do we know that we're making the right decision when we look at, is this really a requirement that we do now, or is this something that just, Sally always likes a red button on her screen, and so we're going to put a red button for Sally. The other thing you have to do that everybody really loves is you have to write this down. You have to document it. You're going to refer to this again and again. If you do it well at the beginning, it will be something that you will have to do over and over again because your stakeholder groups will change, you'll discover more people, and so on. But then once you have decided who's out there, you want to think about it from an analytical point of view. Who are these people? Who are these groups of people? What are they like, and how are they going to react to this particular project? Don't spend a lot of time asking people the question that I hear a lot of people who are theoretical about change management do. How do you feel about this change? How are you feeling about it? Let me say to you days and weeks. They feel bad. They feel really, really bad, and they don't like it. Human beings do not like to change. And I know because I actually got 2 brains this morning. Yes, I was the blue person. I don't know, it just seemed red, white, blue. It must be blue. So people are going to feel bad, and the whole point of managing the stakeholder group is recognizing that change is difficult for humans. They don't like it. Even people who like to change don't like change when it happens to them. And so you want to be able to plan for it. You want to be able to support people through it. You want to be able to get to the end and actually have human beings that want to work wherever it is that you've created this fabulous solution and who know what to do and aren't fighting you every step of the way. And then you want to manage it, and it changes over time. So you can't just come up with a plan and go, I'm done. You have to change it as you go along. Whatever approach you use, you're going to be looking at something that's like this. You have human beings, and you want to move them along some kind of a curve of change. You want to start with making people aware that change is even happening, and then you want them to understand what it means, and you'd like them to accept it, and then maybe some of them, not all of them, by the way, you want them to be committed to it. You want them to be able to help you move it forward. Not everyone will get to that point. If you don't have some kind of a process to do this, you end up with the counterpoints. Instead of people being aware, they just become confused. Instead of people understanding it, they just get a negative perception. This is a terrible project that's going to wreck everything I've built for the last 20 years. Instead of accepting it, they're going to actually start resisting. And once you get that going on the business side of your project is going to be extremely expensive, it's going to be unsuccessful, your requirements are going to be wrong. Because the people who have the information aren't going to be on board with you. As you're doing this, there's lots of pieces, and again, this could be like a whole week-long or longer course in change management. Yes?
We asked on the previous slide, what are some of your strategies or tips to make that curve sharper? Because on fast-track projects, many times the project is finished and you're still going through that change commitment curve, which is kind of gradual, and you want to make that curve be much.
So this, well, if we made, I can make it steeper by making this shorter, right? So I'm not saying this is maybe this is 2 weeks. If it's 2 weeks, you're not going to get a lot of commitment, so it depends on the size of the project. But I absolutely can, and in fact, that's what this is about. You have certain levers that you can pull. So depending on what you're trying to do, and I'll get right to you, and depending on what you're trying, like if you want people to be aware, this is where communications is really important. A lot of people think change management, that's communications. That's a part of it, that's one lever that you pull. That's how you help people understand, know what's happening, be aware of it. When you start to trying to grow understanding of it, you have to have a measurement piece in place. Because if you're not measuring it, you have no concept. Are they understanding or not? And then what else do I need to communicate if they're not? So you have to introduce that to get to that next piece. To get to the next one where people are starting to accept it, you've got to get your leadership on board. And the leadership actually has to start building into the organization what I call a change network of people who are going to help move the change within the organization itself. And then what you want to do is look at what are all the things I need to gain commitment, and that's where you're looking at how do I help this workforce move? How am I going to get people trained? How am I going to get people who are in this team understand where's my career path? Where do I go here? I know COBOL better than anybody, but now what do I do? Where do I go? What is my path? So those are the levers that you plan for and pull to move forward.
I manage a group of cross-functional, per se, functional analysts. So the challenges that we have been having is the roles and responsibilities and change management. So I guess what I need help with is in organizational change management, is it the project manager's role to manage this change, or is it the business analyst's role?
Great question. I will be at the booth all day. Come and talk to me and let's talk through that. Because that's a common question. Who's going to do it? And the answer is everybody has to do it. You can't do it. It can't just be change management, project management separate. The management of the organization completely separate. You've got to build a team. But we can talk at length about that. So once, again, remembering these aren't linear, once you have a clear picture of what you're trying to accomplish, and you've identified who's involved, one of the things that you're going to be doing is eliciting the requirements. And this is one of the places that can be really hard for a business analyst because of something that Nina mentioned. When you come into projects that have taken a long time to go through the review cycle and go through procurement and everything else, some of the people on the team may have the perception we have already done all of this. Here's our requirements. We wrote them down 2 years ago. What is the matter with you? Can't you read? And so one of the things you have to get by is that, because yes, there may have been requirements 2 years ago. Who knows whether all of the legislation is the same? Who knows if the requirements, who knows if the solution you bought actually was what people were thinking at that time? So you really do have to go through a process of understanding, again, what's the business need, and getting people constantly on the same page. What are we trying to accomplish? What is imperative for us to do? And all the time, even though you're the business analyst, you need to be thinking, putting on the hat that the project manager has, which is don't be doing scope creep. If you're bringing something forward as a good business analyst, and you're saying this is something we really need to consider, before you take it forward for a change order, be sure that it is actually a requirement and not just a nice to have thing. Project managers have hard jobs. Yes?
That's where one of our things was, since it was a long project, is, okay, you had all these requirements
Yes.
2 years ago,
Yep.
and since the 2 years, now we have all these changes over here on hold, so how do you incorporate that versus somebody saying, that's out of scope, that's out of scope, that's out of scope?
Great
And
question.
in the end, it caused...
Yes. In the end, what does it cause? Just say it. It doesn't hurt my feelings. I know it causes overruns. It causes too much time. It causes expanding scope. This is why this is so important, even though you've gone through the process, to sit down and say, again, what are we going to do? What's our scope? And at the beginning, get clear on that again. And then have periods in your project where you actually revisit it and say, where are we? What's our timeline? Are there things we're going to have? That's why I like that must-have, should-have. Everything that's not a must-have can go. That's how it's like, hey, when you first start, maybe you can do must-haves, should-haves, and could-haves. But as time goes on, the could-haves go away. There's something we're going to do later on after we've gone live and everybody has survived. And then as you get closer and you're like, oh my gosh, some of those could haves and some of those should haves go away. It's like, yeah, we should have them. We aren't gonna, not now. But remember, going live isn't the end of the universe. Going live is a starting point of improvement that goes after.
You also don't want to put blinders on and say everything's
Absolutely you can't.
because it wasn't there, because
Right.
some of those things need to be.
Absolutely, and the role of a business analyst is a tough one because you're constantly having to play that. And if you're in a small project, sometimes you are the project manager and the business analyst. And then you actually are having all this going on in your own head, which may require therapy. But that's the reality. You have to, and I think a good business analyst always puts themselves, whether they're the project manager or not, if they're going to be any good at it, they listen to all those business requirements, they document it carefully, and then they step across the line and say, now if I was the person who had to hold the scope, hold the budget, and answer all the questions about where we are financially, would I still think this was important? And if the answer is yes, then they absolutely have to take that forward. Yes?
I know in the state, we tend to favor like a waterfall development process.
Yes.
Because we want to know all the numbers and all the costs and all the risks and everything all up front, so someone will pay the bill and say,
Absolutely.
go do your project. My organization has shifted to more of an agile methodology. And you're not going to know all the requirements up front.
You will not.
Scope creep is not the end of the world.
Mm-hmm.
In software, you actually don't know all the time what you want until you see something and you start playing with it.
Mm-hmm.
So Agile builds in the idea that scope creep is going to happen.
Yeah.
The difference is you've got to have an organization behind you that is willing to accept some of that.
That's
And
correct.
prioritize, is schedule more important, is the cost more important,
Yes.
or is the scope more important? And if they say, hey, we're committed to Agile, then scope is one of those things that's going to flex. And so it's an interesting thing to do that paradigm of Agile in a state environment.
It is, and
Sometimes
actually I have done it
it's-
as well, and it is complicated if you're in a waterfall methodology to think through how do I do cycles within that iterations. Yes, it is possible, but you're right, it's challenging. Please come to the booth, I'd love to talk about that. Awesome. So, designing and improving business processes. Is this still
I
me?
think that's still you.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
All right, so.
You're on the heart.
Yeah, designing and improving business processes. I'm not going to read all of the words in this slide. You'll have access to all of this. But the point is, when you're going through this effort, you really want to think about, just like you thought about the people, what's the process? Again, there's a million ways to do this, and they range from really slick, whiz-bang technology that I've heard is supposed to work. I've never actually seen it work more than once. Which is when you get a business process engine and you put your requirements in it and it magically spits out code on the other side, and then the ERP system that you purchase works perfectly, and then everybody changes the requirement and it works perfectly the second time. I've only seen the first time work, I've never seen the second time work. But anyway, there's those, and then there's the methodology that's really not too cost prohibitive, which is taking a bunch of sticky notes and sticking them on the wall. Whether you're doing one that's very sophisticated or whether you're doing one with sticky notes, it's all the same process. And you want to think about some critical things. Where does our process begin? Where's it coming from? What agency, what constituent? Where's the information coming into us? Where's the information going out after us? You want to think about a process not just within your little space, even if your space is big. Think about what's on the outside of either side, because that's going to give you a lot of information. And then think, where are my connections? Where are my integrations to other places along the route? And that gives you the framework to start with. And so if you had your notes on the wall, you could start right there. And then you want to think about, now, how can we make this better? How can we make it shorter? Are there steps that we can consolidate? That effort requires that you have a couple of groups in the session, somebody to do the sticky notes or the business process rules engine, but you also need to have people who really understand how the business works. And you also must have people understand the solution that you're going to use. And I've seen mistakes in both directions. But what I would say has worked really, really well is if you have a solution, if you've already chosen, let's say, an ERP system, have someone who can demonstrate how that ERP would do this function in its baseline format. So let's say it's some application that allows people to get their benefits information online. Before you talk about how you do it today, because if you spend a lot of time documenting how you do it today, you end up with how you do it today, and then you configure a large expensive system to do what you do today, which is kind of crazy. Instead, have someone who knows how the system works show you, well, this is how it works. This is, okay, so I'm a constituent, or I'm a person that works in this department, and I log in here, and I get my information, and this is how I work. And then have this discussion. Is there a business reason that we can't use it just like that? And again, this is something to decide ahead of time. What are business reasons? It's a state law in California that we can't do it that way? That's a good business reason. It's a federal law that we can't do it that way? Really good reason, and a thing to take back to the vendor and say, why are you selling software in this country? Again, identify what are those things that are valid excuses, and I love to have them on the wall. And when people start having a discussion, have that discussion. This changes your business process analysis significantly, and then you can come up with extremely efficient approaches to your processes that also work with the solutions that you've purchased, and not have to maintain incredibly complex integrations and configurations that may be hard to keep over time. Those costs up front of redesigning something, they're small compared to the difficulty, for those of you who work in IT, of maintaining those complex custom configurations or customizations over time. So, and now I think it is you. Business risk. Yeah.
All right. I don't know if Michelle, the one other point that I wanted to make around the prior topic, improving business processes, is we have heard from the advisors that helped us put this course together that one of the things that really to emphasize is that you have an opportunity when you're building a new system or upgrading a system to do that process improvement. And when you have that, whether you use a sticky note way to do things, or you have Visio diagrams and you have all of those processes there and you map them out, to look for those opportunities to actually make those very efficient, or as efficient as possible, and that will go a long way. Because sometimes you find that, in fact, a technical solution isn't what you need at all. In fact, you just need some process reengineering to improve how the flow of information moves throughout your organization. That could solve a lot of issues. So it's good to sort of incorporate that into that business process review as well. So let's talk a little bit about assessing business risk. As part of the initial planning and analysis on whether a project will be approved and back to the FSR process, there's a portion of that where you assess business risk, right? And I'm looking at you because you said that all of that must be known up front. And then you sort of stamp it and put it away and then look at it again, right? But the point is that, as you think about risk, it can be different types of risk. It can be internal to the organization and to the program, and it can be external. So you have to think about both of those, and it can be strategic risk, it could be operational, financial in some cases. It can also be knowledge-oriented, so trying to retain talent or organizational risk, if you will. So we have to think about risk in different ways. Risk can be positive, right? But it can also be a negative risk, and so you need to sort of be able to put that into the context of what you're measuring. There's many different ways to measure risk when you're talking about requirements or situations that might occur during a project or a program. And this is just one example. I mean, there's lots of different ways to do it, but we thought we'd just show one example of how you could do a scoring model. So on the one side, you have business importance, right? What's the impact to the business? How important is it? And then down below, you have the probability. What's the likelihood that that risk will actually occur? And then by assigning a score to that, you can then create, a scatter diagram, if you will, across this 4 quadrants or 2 by 2, and really kind of figure out, all right, what are my high impact to my business? What are my risks that are high impact to my business and high likelihood of occurring? Versus something that might be a low impact and a low likelihood of occurring. You still have to pay attention to these. And by the way, as the project moves forward and internal and external factors change, because we live in a moving world with different things changing both internal and external to the program, we have to revisit our risk assessment. And as business analysts, we play an important role in that to keep that risk assessment active and part of the program so that you can go back to it and say, okay, what has changed from 3 months ago or 6 months ago? Has a new statute passed or law passed, do we need to go back and figure out what that is and how that impacts us? Have requirements changed in such a way, or business need have changed in such a way that it would change how we originally scored these situations? And so again, this is one way to do it. You could lay over this, different kinds of ways to score that and measure that. But we thought we'd show one example today. And you all should get copies of all of this too, provided. So let's move on to managing dynamic requirements. Keyword dynamic. Yes, requirements are not static, right? Too bad, right? So as business analysts, we have to expect that. We really do. We have to know that requirements are going to change from the business. We know that there are going to be new requirements that come up for whatever reason. We know that requirements will go away. And we also know that requirements will be updated or modified. Meanwhile, solution is being developed, right? So it's a lot to manage, no doubt about it. The way that we kind of think about, and I think that's on the next slide, and I'll go back to that. The way that we think about this is, if you at the start of your program, you've elicited your requirements, you've worked with your stakeholders, you now know what your baseline requirements are. You sort of save them and freeze them and put them into, sometimes we call them a traceability matrix or some sort of a tool. That's one way to do it. But the point is that you document it and you baseline it. This is what we did at the start of the project. We documented these business requirements and there they are. Now, as they are modified, deleted, or you get additions, you can go back and trace back to the original requirements and not lose sight of them. It's important here that my picture here is really trying to draw out that these are requests. They're not necessarily, yes, they're going to change, and yes, we're going to add these, or yes, we're going to delete these. These come in as requests, right? Change requests on a project. As you verify and validate that against the solution, what needs to remain at the center of that is the business need. Again, going back to ask the question, must we have this? Is this addressing a business need? Is this going to help us deliver that value that we said in the original business case needed to be achieved? So constantly asking that question until we sound like a broken record, is this going to address a business need? And then of course, this next slide, which has a lot of information on it, which you'll have is just sort of a flow. So again, you baseline the requirements and the scope. Business analyst and project manager working together, sometimes the same person, but you're freezing that scope. Then, as those change requests come in, you're evaluating those against business need, resolving inconsistencies. This is very important, and that's why tracking those requirements is so critical. Because if you have the 2-year situation and you had requirements 2 years ago, and now you're sort of revisiting that, and there's new things and new ideas coming through, you want to make sure that they're not conflicting with something that you've already documented. Or duplicative, right? So, having a method to really trace and track that is hugely important for a business analyst. And then the change control process is just, the governance around that. There needs to be people established up front that are the decision makers around this, with the input from the business analyst team on whether this is really addressing business need and whether we need to hold scope or whether we need to expand scope to address something that's critical. And then finally, my yellow box down here, as requirements change and as they are approved, the business case must be updated if it's going to change your expected outcomes, right? Small changes may not move the needle, right? But if it's a big change, the business case needs to reflect that. Because ultimately your business case is not just your initial sort of evaluation of what the investment is, what the return is on that, but it's also your roadmap to achieving the benefit and the value that you initially set out to achieve. Whether that be, again, it could be service levels, it could be cost reduction, it could be revenue enhancement, whatever that is, the business case will always be true to that. Okay, benefits realization. So this is simply tracking and measuring how are we doing. And I talked earlier about value events. I want to just revisit that again and talk about what I mean by that. So a value event can be thought of as a trigger. It's something that causes value to occur. So if it's cost reduction and there's maybe you're doing a strategic sourcing project and you're going to source supplies differently, or you're going to consolidate vendors. When that happens and those contracts go away, now you're sourcing, paper supplies or something from one vendor, that's a value event. And so that's a time element tied to that where you're going to achieve that value. And you can then report on that on a scorecard or however you do it to make sure that your stakeholders and your sponsors understand on a regular and a consistent basis how you're achieving the original value of the case. So this is another one of my favorite topics because I do this all the time for a living and I love to do this stuff, but it's great to see how a project achieves its initial vision along the journey. Versus, there's some approaches to look at a project at the end of it and then look back at the original case and say, how did we do? It's much more interesting, I think, to see it along the way. And it also, the other point I wanted to make on this slide is something called quick wins that we talk about sometimes. Quick wins is a way to really, at the start of a program, especially if it's a cost reduction or a revenue enhancement program, to capture those quick wins. So if something, sometimes you'll get those quick benefits right up front, right? You're changing some processes, you're becoming more efficient, and you're realizing it, you're seeing it in your day-to-day business and operations. Document those, bring those to the top so that they can be, collected and shared with stakeholders, with sponsors, with the team, because there's nothing like seeing, your value being realized quickly up front to build that momentum and, have the long charge of going through, a year-long or 18-month-long or 2-year project and continuing to build that momentum and seeing that light at the end of the tunnel and going, yes, we're going to do this.
And I want to tag on to that because you asked the question, like, how do you move a team faster? And there was a discussion briefly about Agile. This is a place, even if you're doing kind of a waterfall methodology and your project's going to take 4 years, if you identify upfront points of value and you hit them, that is a really huge boost to your stakeholders. Because they're not going to see, if you're not in the project team, you don't necessarily see what's happening, but if you can say, look, we have saved this much money, or it used to take people 4 days to get this information and now it takes 2. That kind of information helps people to see a program as being something real rather than wait 4 years and go, yes, we got the software in. So that's a huge way to get people up that curve faster.
Okay, so you guys have at your tables copies of these. We did like a front back of these next 2 slides so that you could take these with you. This is just the first one that has the green boxes on the ends and the maroon boxes in the middle, or box in the middle. This is a typical, implementation timeline. I heard software delivery lifecycle, SDLC. I heard an acronym earlier, I think from DMV.
OMG.
Hey, I'm not going down now.
Yeah. So design, build, test, deploy, right? We're all pretty familiar with this. At the beginning of that is what we call strategic planning and analysis, and this is where I love to work. This is great, great stuff. This is the upfront assessment. Why are we doing this? Should we do this? What are we addressing? What are our business drivers? What are we setting out to achieve? Understanding what are the costs and the benefits associated with taking this on. How long will it take us to do this? What's the payback period? When do I start seeing my benefits? And then assessing that feasibility and risk. And so when you look at this, I should have said in the beginning, this is what a business analyst is doing throughout the life cycle of a project. And there's a lot of words on this, and I could have put a lot more on here, but I just kind of highlighted a few points that we could fit here. But this is meant to illustrate that there's a lot that happens up front, but then the business analyst doesn't go away. The business analyst is totally engaged with stakeholders, the business, technology, being that liaison, all the way through. And when you get to the end, and you're in measure and reinforce is what I like to call that phase, where you're live, you know, it's fantastic, you're using this great new system, things are better than they ever were before.
Oh my gosh, I've
Now-
been on that program.
You're measuring it, right? And you're reinforcing it. And what I mean by reinforcing it is you're actually looking ahead as a visionary, as a business analyst, knowing what the business is thinking and what technology is offering, and saying, what can I be doing to drive continuous improvement, whether it be people, processes, or technology. We always go back to those three. So, and one thing that I don't know if I wanted to say it here, but I will because it's top of mind. Also, you know, sometimes we think, all right, we've got this 5-year strategy, right, for my department, and this is what the leadership has set out, and this is what we're going to do and achieve in the next 5 years. And so there's like, you know, bullet points of things that we're going to do. We're going to become more efficient in this department. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. We're going to implement this solution. What a business analyst can help do is actually turn that around a little bit and drive what the next strategy is going to look like, because you know what's happening on the ground in terms of what the business is doing and thinking, what the citizens need, and what technology is offering as it is continually improving. And so if you can bring those things together, you're actually then aligning your strategy of your department, your agency, the state, with what technology is delivering and what the business needs. And I think that's really key. So anyway, this was meant to illustrate, you can take this away with you, what the, you know, what are the different things around. And you'll see some of these I've repeated because it's important to know that, again, this is iterative, and you'll be redoing or going back and revisiting some of these items and critical points as you move along the implementation timeline. I think that's all I had here. This next one, so if you look at the other side, it's basically taking this first box, strategic planning and analysis, and it's kind of putting a magnifying glass on it and drilling down even further and breaking it into, you know, what happens in that first green box, right? So assessing business needs, again, defining those goals and objectives, you're identifying those stakeholders, you're doing what we call a stakeholder impact assessment, you're figuring out how is this going to impact the people that are actually going to use the solution or support the solution. Then you move to collecting and analyzing those requirements, you're documenting those, the as-is, and your to-be processes, what is this going to look like in the future. You're assessing that feasibility and risk. And then in the end, before you move to execution, you're able to provide input as a business analyst to the program roadmap so that you know this is the scope, this is the baseline requirements, this is how long it's going to take to get there, this is what the change curve is going to look like and how we're going to have to move across that. And then you have here these stakeholder checkpoints, right? So not meant to be literal, but just the key is you're going to have these checkpoints in with your stakeholders. So they're continually engaged. They know where the program's going. They're influencing where the program's going, and they're providing input. And you're always going back and validating. Are we still on track? Are we still on track? Are we still meeting that business need?
And let me just tag on to that this for a minute. This is the part where I said a lot of times business analysts struggle because people want to skip over a piece. This is the piece people want to skip over. This is the piece that people say, we already did all of that. So this is the piece you definitely do not want to skip over, because this is where you get the chance to really get on the same page and make sure that everybody understands what is it that we're driving for, especially if you have a project team. Let everybody see the solution. I can't tell how many times I've gone to a project and the people who are building the solution were never in the demos. They never saw what was actually purchased versus the really fancy one that the vendor showed them with all the things you didn't purchase. So this is the time when you get to get people on the same page. And if you don't do that, you have already set up different languages and different understanding from the very beginning. So this usually takes us what? 12 weeks?
Yes.
Depending on the program, but this is not a huge, long process. This is not a year and a half. This is a quick getting on the same page. And Nina often says you need to go slow to go fast. Yes. I always say, go fast to go slow, but then that's wrong. Go slow to go fast. This is the point where you really want to do this. It will save you immense time later on. It gets everybody on the same page.
Thank you. That was a lot, right? That was a lot of information.